Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to fully connect the Atlantic world together by introducing us to European exploration and the Columbian exchange. So this is going to be kind of unpleasant, just a warning moving forward, brace yourself for that. So let's dive in. Here's our basic objective questions for the day. So take a minute and make sure you understand these, and then let's get into our narrative. So our story starts with the Reconquista. The Reconquista is the Spanish and Portuguese Christians retaking over the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslim caliphates and organizations that had previously held it. So over the process of a number of years, we start getting the Iberian Peninsula, quote-unquote, reconquered for the Christians. In the end, this created the nation-states of Portugal and Spain, and you get these sort of united, powerful monarchies, and they're going to benefit both from the momentum of having just reconquered their territory from, quote-unquote, again, foreign invaders, and also access to technology from the Muslim and Asian world. Things like new map-making technology, the Latin triangular sail, navigational techniques, both the astrolabe and the magnetic compass, and then the building of caravels, which are these sturdier ships that can withstand significantly more sort of ocean-going storms. So from all of this, we're going to get a renaissance in European shipbuilding, leading to Europeans kicking off this whole quote-unquote age of exploration, where Europeans set out to find new trade routes and new sources of wealth abroad now that they've solved a lot of the domestic issues within their countries. One of the things that especially the Portuguese were trying to do is tap into these incredibly valuable trade routes. With both after the Mongol empires, when the Mongol empires reopened the Silk Road, and then later the Ottoman Empire and the Ming dynasties sort of solidified control over their territories and opened up trade, you started to get a whole bunch of new Asian products flooding into Europe. We're talking tea and silk and spices and porcelain and stuff like that. But because it had to travel through a variety of different kingdoms, each of these kingdoms passed their own taxes, each of the merchants charged more money, and these products were incredibly expensive. And so for Spain and Portugal, who were sort of on the hinterlands far away from these European trade routes, they wanted to try to see if they could find a way to bypass the previous trade systems and potentially even discover either new trade routes or new sources of wealth. We talked briefly about Prince Henry the Navigator when we talked about the Indian Ocean and when we talked about the West African trading empires. Henry was a Portuguese noble who set up a patronage system for navigators, helping to train and develop the next generation of Portuguese navigators, with the goal being to again establish new trade routes and to get Portugal to be able to get a cut of this incredibly lucrative trade system that was already in place. Bartholomew Dias is important as the first Portuguese who was able to round the sort of Cape of Good Hope here, establishing that there was a sea route to go around Africa and to get into the Indian Ocean. And then eventually Vasco da Gama is going to get a trade route all the way to India. So with this, we get both Portuguese settlements along the coast of Africa and also Portuguese traders attempting to go around and get into the Indian Ocean. The Spanish also attempted to do this and established their own fleets. At the Battle of Guinea, a Portuguese fleet met a Spanish fleet, and the Portuguese crushed the Spanish. This happened right off the coast of Africa here. And in the aftermath of this, we got a treaty that drew a line across the world and said that Portugal, because of their victory in this battle, gets everything below this line. So they negotiated it, Pope notarized it for them, or the 14th century equivalent, or 15th century equivalent. And in the end, Portugal is going to get exclusive right to sail around the coast of Africa, which again we haven't actually established gets you to India or China, but they suspected that it did. So enter Christopher Columbus. He was born in Genoa in what is today Italy. He tried to convince the Portuguese that his plan to sail west instead of east to get to Asia was relevant. No one bought his basic arguments, not necessarily because they thought the world was flat or you couldn't get there that way, but because If you went that direction, they thought that the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean or whatever massive world ocean you had in between these was way too large. Columbus thought he had done some calculations and suspected that the world was pear-shaped, and so he thought that the distance was much smaller than everyone else did. And so the reason that no one would fund Columbus's expeditions was not necessarily because they thought he would fall off the edge of the world, but that they thought he would run out of supplies somewhere in the middle of this massive ocean. But Columbus was convinced he was right, and the King and Queen of Spain had been locked out of the lucrative path around Africa, so they figured, what do we really have to lose here? We can give this guy 3 ships, he'll probably die in the middle of the ocean, and we never have to think about him again. Columbus, of course, as we know, sailed in 1492 across the Atlantic Ocean, and crazily enough, he made landfall right about the place where he expected to. Columbus thought that he was in Asia and began exploring, looking for a path to find a way to the court of the Chinese emperors, and he struggled to find that because, again, he's in the Caribbean, not in Asia, and so it's a long way from there to the court of the Yongle emperor. Columbus sends a letter back explaining what he saw, quote, all these islands are densely populated with the best people under the sun. They have neither ill will nor treachery. All of them, men and women alike, go about naked as their mothers bore them. Although some of the women wear a small piece of cotton, they have neither irons nor weapons except canes, which they place at the end of a sharp stick. Everything they make is done with stone tools. I have not learned that they had any form of private property, etc., etc. He thinks he's, of course, in a province of China, but obviously a significant distance from that in reality. He and his men then set up a fort on the island of Hispaniola called Fort Navidad, and he sails away. By the time Columbus returns, the fort at Navidad has been mostly destroyed due to conflicts with Native Americans over, generally taking stuff from them. And so when Columbus comes back, he decided to quell native resistance. And so we have this, quote, since the admiral perceived daily the people of the land were taking up arms, ridiculous weapons in reality, he hastened to proceed to the country and disperse and subdue them by force of arms, the people of the entire island. For this he chose 200 foot soldiers and 20 cavalry with many crossbows and small cannon, lances, and swords, and a still more terrible weapon against the Indians. In addition to the horses was 20 hunting dogs, who were turned loose and immediately tore the Indians apart. He then sent expedition after expedition into the interior, where they started rounding up people who would die in captivity, and then Columbus attempted to force, quote, but too many of the slaves died in captivity, and so Columbus, desperate to pay back the dividends to those who had invested, had to make good on his promises to fill the ships with gold. In the province of Haiti, where he and his men imagined huge gold fields to exist, they ordered all persons 14 years or older to collect a certain quantity of gold every 3 months. When they bought it, they were given a copper token to hang around their neck. Indians found without a copper token had their hands cut off and bled to death. So, not ideal there. We'll talk more about Columbus and his brutality in future lectures. But in general, what happened is that, depending on who you asked, either people told lies about Columbus or they very accurately reported his exploits. He was then clapped into irons, his governorship was taken away, and he was brought back to Spain in chains. But this did not necessarily lead to better treatment of Native Americans, as future Spanish explorers and governors were, if not equally brutal, at least close. Columbus would eventually win his freedom and have 2 more somewhat irrelevant voyages of exploration, and in the end, he would never get the glory and the wealth that he felt like he deserved for his amazing exploits. The downside of this whole thing is everywhere the Europeans went, diseases spread. Eurasia, because it has so much more interaction between different groups of people, which helps spread disease, plus has far more domesticated animals, which we'll talk about in a minute, which we already talked about. Living in close proximity to domesticated animals also leads diseases to jump, and so diseases like smallpox and measles spread wildly among the Native Americans. We can see here the estimated population of Mexico. This great dying led to a massive collapse of Native American society and paved the way for the conquest that we're going to be talking about in future lectures. Here's an account of smallpox coming in. and the effect of the Spanish returning. Quote, "There were so many deaths that there was often no one to care for the sick. They could not be attended. On some the pustules broke out far apart. They did not cause much suffering, nor did many die of them. But many others were harmed by them on their faces. Face and nose were left roughened. Some in their eyes injured by them, and they were blinded. Many were crippled by it, but not entirely. The pestilence lasted through 60 days before it diminished. When it was realized that it was beginning to end, the pestilence became more prevalent in the month of Teoleco, and it was diminished by a different month. The brave Mexican warriors were indeed weakened by it, and it was after all this happened that the Spanish came back." And so we'll talk about in future lectures the effect of the conquest, but disease played a very important role in weakening and leading to the collapse of Native American societies before the Spanish even really came in to attempt to subjugate them. The other effect of this, beyond the spread of diseases, is the exchange of other biological things. We see animals and plants being exchanged between these two continents where they had not been present for a very long time. Most importantly, beyond diseases, which of course we already talked about, large domesticated animals are brought to the Americas, which is going to transform American society, as are cereal grasses and things like sugarcane and coffee, which are going to become very important. Going the other direction, the potato is probably the most important because potatoes grow in very difficult climates. They can be kept in the soil until they are eaten, and so that's going to lead to a massive population shift in Europe as areas that previously couldn't support large populations all of a sudden now can because they have a staple crop that's calorie dense and can support large numbers of people. So we'll deal with the effects of that moving forward. Here's a description of the effect of the Columbian exchange. Quote, "The people of the Americas realized that crops with higher caloric value could not only feed more people, but also allowed people to work harder because they were more energized. This led to an adoption of American crops by European peasantries that changed entire cuisines in various cultures and spread rapidly throughout the Americas, Europe, and finally Africa. An important crop in Europe was potatoes that could be left in the ground until they were ready to be eaten, and animals were also a key part of the Columbian exchange. Horses, pigs, sheep, and cattle were all European animals that flourished rapidly in the Americas because they were able to reproduce without being hindered by predators. So basically you're introducing a bunch of useful but invasive species that are forever going to change the biodiversity of all continents on Earth. Eventually, the Spanish do manage to circumnavigate the globe and get their trade route to Asia. Ferdinand Magellan finds a way to navigate through the straits on the bottom of Latin America, sails across the Pacific Ocean, and lands in the Philippines. In attempts to forcibly Christianize the natives, Ferdinand Magellan is killed, but his crew does return back to Europe, and so the Spanish are now able to connect into these global trade routes as well. But everyone at this point knows that these two continents are now something new. And so it's going to kick off a race to claim as much of this Atlantic world as possible and to integrate North America and South America into the already existing trade routes of Europe, Africa, and Asia. So that's where we're going to pick up our story from here. So here's our objectives for today. Hopefully you can answer them in some detail. And thank you for listening.